The Ancestor by H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. 1. When my cousin, Ambrose Perry, retired from the active practice of medicine, he was still a comparatively young man, ruddy and vigorous, and in his 50s. He had had a very lucrative practice in Boston, and though he was fond of his work, he was somewhat more given to the development of certain of his theories which, and he was an individualist in this, he did not inflict upon his colleagues, whom, truth to tell, he was inclined to look down upon as too bound by the most orthodox methods, and too timid to venture forth upon experiments of their own without the sanction of the American Medical Association. He was a cosmopolitan in every sense of the word, and he had studied extensively in Europe, in Vienna, at the Sorbonne, at Heidelberg, and he had travelled widely. But for all that, he was content to lose himself in wild country, in Vermont, when at last he chose retirement to climax his brilliant career. He went into virtual seclusion at his home, which he had built in the middle of a dense wood, and outfitted with as complete a laboratory as his money could buy. No one heard from him, and for 3 years not a word of his activities reached the public prints or the private correspondence of his relatives and friends. It was thus, with considerable surprise, that I received a letter from him. I found it waiting on my return from a sojourn in Europe, asking me to come and spend some time with him if possible. I replied regretfully that I had now to set about finding a position for myself, and expressed my pleasure at hearing from him, and the hope that some day I might be able to avail myself of his invitation, which was as kind as it was unexpected. His answer came by return mail, offering me a handsome emolument if I would accept the position of secretary, by which, I was certain, he meant me to do everything about the house as well as take notes. Perhaps my motivation was as much curiosity as attractiveness to the remuneration, which was generous. I accepted as quickly, almost fearfully, lest he withdraw his offer, and within a week I presented myself at my cousin's rambling house, built in the Pennsylvania Dutch farm manner, though of but one story with sharply pointing gables and deeply pitched roof. I had had some difficulty finding it, even after receiving my cousin's explicit instructions, for he was at least 10 miles from the nearest village, which was a hamlet called Tyburn, and his house was set so far back from the little travelled road, and had so slight a lane leading up to it, that I was constrained to believe for some time that I had travelled past it in my eagerness to arrive at the hour I had promised. An alert German shepherd dog guarded the premises, but though he was chained, he was not at all vicious, for, apart from watching me intently, he neither growled nor made any move in my direction when I went up to the door and rang the bell. My cousin's appearance, however, shocked me, for he was thin and gaunt. The hale, ruddy man I had last seen almost 4 years ago had vanished, and in his place stood a mere travesty of his former self. His hearty vigour, too, seemed sadly diminished, though his handshake was firm and strong, and his eyes no less keen. "Welcome, Henry," he cried at sight of me. "Even Ginger seems to have accepted you without so much as a bark." At the mention of his name, the dog came bounding forward, as far as his long chain would reach, tail wagging. "But come in, you can always put your car up later on." I did as I was bidden, and found the interior of his house very masculine, almost severe in its appointments. A meal was on the table, and I learned that, far from expecting me to do other than serve as his secretary, my cousin had a cook and handyman who lived above his garage, and had no intention whatsoever that I should do more than take down such notes as he intended to give me, and to file the results of his experiments. For he was experimenting. He made so much clear at once, though he said nothing of the nature of his experiments. And all during the meal, in the course of which I met both Edward and Meta Reed, the couple who took care of the house and grounds, he asked only about myself, what I had been doing, what I hoped to do. At 30, he reminded me, there was considerably less time to dawdle about deciding on one's future, and occasionally, though only as my own answer to his questions brought up their names, about other members of the family who were, as always, widely scattered. Yet I felt that he asked about me only to satisfy the amenities of the situation, and without any real interest, though he did once hint that if only I could turn to medicine for my career, he might be persuaded to see me through college in pursuit of my degree. But all this, I felt sure, was only the superficiality, the politeness of the moment, representing those aspects of our first meeting in some years which were to be got over with at the earliest opportunity. There was, moreover, that in his manner which suggested a suppressed impatience at this subject he himself had initiated, an impatience with me for my preoccupation with his questions, and at himself for having so far yielded to the conventionalities of the situation as to have asked questions about matters in which he was plainly not interested at all. The Reeds, man and wife, who were both in their 60s, were subdued. They made little conversation, not only because Mrs. Reed both cooked and served her dinner, but because they were plainly accustomed to carrying on an existence apart from their employers. For all that, they ate at his table. They were both greying, yet they managed to look far more youthful than Ambrose, and they showed none of the signs of the physical deterioration which had come upon my cousin. The meal went on, with only the dialogue between Ambrose and myself to break the silence. The Reeds partook of the meal not in subservience, but with a mark of indifference, though I did not notice 2 or 3 times that quick, sharp glances passed from one to the other of them at something my cousin said, but that was all. It was not until we had retired to Ambrose's study that he touched upon the subject closest to my thoughts. My cousin's study adjoined his laboratory, which was at the rear of the house. The kitchen and large dining and living room combined came next, and the bedrooms, curiously, were at the front of the house. Once in the cosy study, Ambrose relaxed, his voice filled with the tremor of excitement. "You will never guess the direction my experiments have taken since I left practice, Henry," he began, "and I dare to wonder at my temerity in telling you. Were it not indeed that I need someone to set down these amazing facts, I would not do so. But now that I am on the road to success, I must think of posterity. I have in short made successful efforts to recapture all my past, down to the most minute nooks and crannies of human memory, and I am now further convinced that by the same methods I can extend the perceptive process to hereditary memory and recreate the events of man's heredity. I see your expression. You doubt me." "On the contrary, I am astounded at the possibilities in it," I answered, quite truthfully, though I failed to admit that a stab of alarm possessed me simultaneously. "Ah, good. I sometimes think that because of the means I must use to induce the state of mind necessary to this ceaseless probing of past time, I have gravely disappointed the Reeds, for they look upon all my experimentation on human beings as fundamentally unchristian, and treading upon forbidden ground." I wanted to ask what means he had reference to, but I knew that in good time he would tell me, if he had a mind to. If he had not, no question of mine would bring the answer, and presently he came to it. "I have found that a combination of drugs and music, at a time when the body is half starved, induces the mood and makes it possible to cast back in time and sharpen all the faculties to such a degree that memory is regained. I can tell you, Henry, I have achieved the most singular and remarkable results. I have actually gone back to memory of the womb, incredible as it may seem." He spoke with great intensity. His eyes shone, his voice trembled. Plainly, he was exhilarated beyond ordinary stimulation by his dreams of success. This had been one of his goals when he was still in practice. Now he had used his considerable means to further his ambition to achieve success in this, and he seemed to have accomplished something. So much I was ready to admit, however cautiously, for his experiments explained his appearance. Drugs and starvation could easily account for his gauntness, which was in fact a kind of emaciation. He had starved himself so frequently and so steadily that he had not only lost his excess weight, but he had reduced beyond the point of wisdom his health. Furthermore, as I sat listening to him, I could not help observing that he had all the aspects of fanaticism, and I knew that no demur I could offer would affect him in the slightest or bring about any deviation whatsoever in his direction. He had his eyes fixed on this strange goal, and he would permit nothing and no one to deflect from it. "But you will have the task of transcribing my shorthand notes, Henry," he went on less intensely, "for of course I have kept them, some of them written in a trance-like state, quite as if I were possessed by some spirit guide, which is an absurdity, naturally. They range backward in time to just before my birth, and I am now engaged in probing ancestral memory. You shall see how far I have got when you have time to examine and transcribe such data as I have set down." With that, my cousin turned to other matters and soon excused himself, vanishing into his laboratory. 2. It took me fully a fortnight to assimilate and copy Ambrose's notes, which were more extensive than he had led me to believe, and also disturbingly revelatory. I had already come to look upon Ambrose as extremely quixotic, but now I was convinced that a strong vein of aberration was manifest in his makeup as well, for the relentless driving of himself to achieve an end which was incapable of proof, for the most part, and promised no boon to mankind, even if his goal were reached, seemed to me to border on irrational fanaticism. He was not interested so much for the information he might obtain in this incessant probing of memory, as he was in the experiment for its own sake. And what was most disturbing about it was the patient evidence, which might at first have had only the proportions of a hobby, was becoming obsessive to such an extent that all other matters were relegated to second place, not excluding his health. At the same time, I was forced to admit that the material the notes contained was often deeply surprising. There was no question but that my cousin had found some way to tap the stream of memory. He had established beyond doubt that everything that happened to a human being was registered in some compartment of the brain, and that it needed but the proper bridge to its place of storage in memory to bring it to consciousness once more. By recourse to drugs and music, he had gone back into the past to such a degree that his notes, as finally put together, constituted an exact biography which was in no way complicated by the glossing over of wish-fulfillment dreams, the enchantment of distance, or the ego gratifications which always play a part in the adjustment of the individual's personality to life's disappointments, which have dealt blows to the ego. My cousin's course, so far, was undeniably fascinating. For the immediately past years, his notes mentioned many people we knew in common, but soon the 2 decades between us began to become obvious, and his memory concerned strangers to me and events in which I had no part, even indirectly. The notes were especially revealing in what they conveyed of my cousin's dominant thoughts during his youth and early manhood, in their cryptic references to the themes which were constantly uppermost in his thoughts. Argued vehemently with Derleth about the primal source, the chimpanzee linkage too recent. Primal fish? So he wrote of his days at the Sorbonne and at Vienna. Man did not always live in trees, so says von Wiedersehen. Agreed. Presumably he swam. What role, if any, did man's ancestors have in the age of the brontosaur? Such notes as these, including many far more detailed, were interspersed with the daily records of his years, mingling with accounts of parties, romances, an adolescent duel, differences with his parents and the like, all the assorted trivia of one man's life. This subject appeared to hold my cousin's interest with an astonishing consistency. His more recent years, of course, were filled with it, but it recurred all the way through his life from the age of 9 onward, when on one occasion he had asked our grandfather to explain the family tree and demand to know what was beyond the registered beginnings of the line. There was, too, in these notes, certain evidence of how much he was taxing himself in his obsessive experiment, for his handwriting had undergone a marked decrease in legibility from the time he had first begun to chronicle his memories to the present. That is, as he went backward through time to his earliest years, and indeed into the place of darkness which was the womb, for he had accomplished his return, if his notes were not a skillful fabrication. His script grew steadily more illegible, quite as if they were a change in degrees with the change in the age of his memories, which was as fantastic a concept, I felt then, as my cousin's belief that he could reach back into ancestral and hereditary memory, both involving the memory of his forebears for many generations, and presumably transmitted in the genes and chromosomes from which they had sprung. To a very large extent, however, I suspended judgment while I was putting his notes in order, and there was no mention of the notes except for the help I asked once or twice when I could not decipher a word in Ambrose's script. Read over, when at last it was completed, the transcript was impressive and cogent, and I handed it to my cousin at last with mixed feelings and not without some suspension of belief. "Are you convinced?" he asked me. "As far as you have gone, yes," I admitted. "You shall see," he replied imperturbably. I undertook to remonstrate with him about the diligence with which he pursued this dream of his. In the 2 weeks it had taken me to assimilate and copy his notes, he had plainly driven himself beyond the bounds of reason. He had taken so little food, and had slept so little, that he had grown noticeably thinner and more haggard than he had been on the day of my arrival. He had been secluded in his laboratory day and night, for long hours at a time. Indeed, on many occasions in that fortnight, there were but 3 of us at the table for meals, Ambrose had not come out of the laboratory. His hands had a tendency to tremble, and there was a hint of palsy about his mouth, while his eyes burned with the fire of the fanatic, to whom all else the goal of his fanaticism had ceased to exist. The laboratory was out of bounds for me, though my cousin had no objection to showing me about the extensive laboratory. He required the utmost solitude when he was conducting his experiments, nor had he any intention of setting down exactly what drugs he had recourse to, though I had reason to believe that cannabis indica, or Indian hemp, commonly known as hashish, was one of them. In the punishment he inflicted on his body in pursuit of his wild dream to recapture his ancestral and hereditary memory, a goal he sought daily and often nightly as well, without surcease, so much so that I saw him with increasing rarity, though he sat for a long time with me on the night I finally gave him the transcript of his notes, tracing the course of his life through his recaptured memory, going over each page with me, making certain small corrections and additions, striking out a few passages here and there, and in general improving the narrative as I had transcribed it. A retyping was obviously necessary, but what then, if I were not to attend him in the actual course of his experiments? But my cousin had yet another sheaf of notes ready for me when the retyping was finished, and this time the notes were not of his own memories, but ranged back through time. They were the memories of his parents, his grandparents, his forebears, even before them, not specific, as were his own, but only general, yet enough to convey an amazing picture of the family before his own generation. They were memories of the great cataclysm, of major events of history, of the earth in its youth. They were such recreations of times past as I would have thought impossible for one man to set down. Yet here they were, undeniably impressive and unforgettable, an accomplishment by any standard. I was convinced that they were a skillful fabrication, yet I dared not pass judgment on Ambrose, whose fanatical belief brooked no doubt. I copied them as carefully as I copied his earlier notes, and in but a few days I had finished and handed the new transcript to him. "You need not doubt me, Henry," he said, smiling grimly. "I see it in your eyes. What would I have to gain by making a false record? I'm not prone to self-deception. I am not qualified to judge, Ambrose, perhaps not even to believe or disbelieve." "That is well enough," agreed my cousin. I pressed him to tell me what I must do next, but he suggested that I wait on his pleasure. I might take time to explore the woods or roam the fields on the far side of the road until he had more work ready for me. I planned to take his suggestion and explore the adjoining woods, but this was never to be done, for other events intervened. That very night I was set in a different direction, providing a decided change from the routine of my cousin's increasingly difficult notes, for in the middle of the night Reed came to awaken me and tell me that Ambrose wanted me in his laboratory. I dressed and went down at once. I found Ambrose stretched out on the operating table, clad in the worn, mouse-coloured dressing gown he usually wore. He was in a semi-conscious state, yet not so far gone that he failed to recognise me. "Something's happened to my hands," he said with effort. "I'm going under. Will you take down anything I may say?" "What is it?" I asked. "A temporary nerve block, perhaps. A muscular cramp. I don't know. They'll be all right tomorrow." "All right," I said. "I'll take down anything you may say." I took his pad and pencil and sat waiting. The atmosphere of the laboratory, ill-lit, with but one low red light near the operating table, was eerie. My cousin looked far more like a corpse than a man under the influence of drugs. Moreover, there was playing in one corner an electric phonograph, so that the low discordant strains of Stravinsky's Le Secret du Prétemps flowed through the room and took possession of it. My cousin lay perfectly still, and for a long time not a sound escaped him. He had sunk into the deep drugged sleep in which he carried on his experiment, and I could not have awakened him had I tried. Perhaps an hour elapsed before he began to speak, and then he spoke so disjointedly that I was hard put to catch his words. "Forest sunk into earth," he said. "Great ones fighting, tearing, run, run." And again, "New trees for old. Footprint 10 feet across. We live in cave, cold, damp, fire." I put down everything he said, insofar as I could catch his muttered words, for his hints were of great beasts that roamed the face of his land, and fought and tore, walking through forests as though they were grass, seeking out and devouring mankind the dwellers in caves and holes under the surface of the earth. But the effort of driving himself back so far into the past was a singular strain on my cousin Ambrose, and when at last he came back to consciousness that night, he shuddered, directing me to turn off the phonograph, and muttered something about degenerative tissues, curiously allied to my dreams, my memories, and announced that we would all rest for a while before he resumed his experiments. 3. It is possible that if my cousin could have been persuaded to rest his experiment on the admitted probability of ultimate success and taken care of himself, he might have avoided the consequences of pushing himself beyond the boundaries mortal man was meant to go. But he did not do so. Indeed, he scorned my every suggestion, and reminded me that he was the doctor, not I. My retort that, like all doctors, he was more careless of himself as patient than he would have been of anyone else fell on deaf ears, yet even I could not have foreseen what was to take place, though Ambrose's vague hint about degenerative tissues ought to have lent direction to my contemplation of the harm he was doing himself by the addiction to drugs which had made him their victim. For a week he rested. Then he resumed his experiments, and soon I was once more putting his notes into typescript. But this time his notes were increasingly difficult to decipher. His script was indeed deteriorating, even as he had hinted, and moreover their subject was often very difficult to follow, though it was evident that Ambrose had gone far back in time. The possibility remained, of course, and was strong, that my cousin had fallen victim to a kind of self-hypnosis, and that far from experiencing any such memory as he chronicled, he was reproducing from the memory of books he had read and salient aspects of the lives of ancient cave and tree dwellers. He was reproducing from the memory of books he had read the salient aspects of the lives of ancient cave and tree dwellers, yet there were disturbingly clear indications from time to time that the observations he made were not made from any printed text or the memory of such a text, though I had no way of seeking out such possible sources for my cousin's bizarre chroniclings. I saw Ambrose increasingly seldom, but on the rare occasions when I did see him, I could not avoid noticing the alarming degree to which he had yielded to drugs and starvation. His emaciation was complicated by certain repellent signs of degeneration. He tended to slaver at his food, and his eating habits became so deplorable that Mrs. Reed was pointedly absent from the table at more than one occasion, though, because of Ambrose's growing dislike of leaving his laboratory, we were not often more than 3 at table. I do not remember just when the drastic alteration in Ambrose's habits came about, but I believe I had been at the house just over 2 months. Now that I think back to it, it seems to me that events were signalled by Ginger, my cousin's dog, which began to act up most restlessly. Whereas hitherto he had been a singularly well-behaved dog, now he began to bark often at night, and by day he whined and moved about the house and yard with an air of alarm. Mrs. Reed said of him, "That dog smells or hears something he don't like." Perhaps she spoke truly. For all that, I paid little attention. It was about this time that my cousin elected to remain in his laboratory altogether, instructing me to leave his food on a tray outside the laboratory door. I took issue with him, but he never opened the door, nor came out, and very often he left his food stand for some time before he took it in, so that Mrs. Reed made ever less attempts to serve him hot food. For most of the time, it had grown cold by the time he took it in. Curiously, none of us ever saw Ambrose take his food. The tray might stand for an hour, 2 hours, even 3, then suddenly it would be gone, only to be replaced later by an empty tray. His eating habits also underwent a change. Though he had formerly been a heavy coffee drinker, now he spurned it, returning his cup untouched so many times that Mrs. Reed no longer troubled to serve it. He seemed to grow ever more partial to simpler foods, meat, potatoes, lettuce, bread, and was not attracted to salads or most casserole dishes. Sometimes his empty tray contained notes, but these were growing fewer and farther between, and such as they were I found almost impossible to transcribe, for his handwriting now, as well as in the context of his notes, there was the same distressing deterioration. He seemed to have difficulty properly holding a pencil, and his lines were scrawled in large letters over all the sheets of paper without any sense of order, though this was not entirely unexpected in one heavily dosed with drugs. The music which welled forth from the laboratory was even more primitive. Ambrose had obtained certain records of ethnic music, Polynesian, ancient Indian, and the like, and it was these he now played to exclusion of all else. These were weird sounds indeed, and peculiarly trying in endless repetition, however interesting they were at first hearing, and they prevailed with monotonous insistence, night and day, for over a week, when one night the phonograph began to manifest every indication of having run down or worn out, and then abruptly stopped. It was not thereafter heard again. It was about this time that the notes ceased to appear, and concomitant with this development, there were two others. The dog, Ginger, erupted into frantic barking during the night, at fairly regular intervals, as if someone were invading the property. I got up once or twice, and once I did think I saw some unpleasantly large animal scuttling into the woods, but nothing came of this. It was gone by the time I had got outside, and however wild this portion of Vermont was, it was not bear country, nor, for that matter, was there any likelihood of encountering in the woods anything larger or more dangerous than a deer. The other development was more disturbing. Mrs. Reed noticed it first, and called my attention to it, a pervasive and highly repellent musk, clearly an animal odour, which seemed to emanate from the laboratory. Could my cousin somehow have brought an animal in from the woods through the back door of his laboratory, which opened out onto the woods? This was always a possibility, but in truth I knew of no animal which might give out so powerful a musk. Efforts to question Ambrose from this side of the door would of no avail. He resolutely refused to make any answer, and even the threat of the Reeds, that they would leave, unable any longer to work in such a stench, did not move him. After 3 days of it, the Reeds departed with their belongings, and I was left alone to take care of Ambrose and his dog. In the shock of discovery, the exact sequence of events thereafter is no longer very clear. I know that I determined to reach my cousin by one way or other. Though all my pleadings remained unanswered, I lightened my burdens as much as possible by unchaining the dog that morning and letting him roam. I made no attempt to undertake the various tasks Reed had performed, but spent my time going to and from the laboratory door. I had long ago given up trying to look into the laboratory from outside, for its windows were high rectangles parallel to the roof, and like the single window in the door, they were covered over so as to make it impossible to look in upon any experiment underway inside. Though my cajolery and pleadings had no effect on Ambrose, I knew that ultimately he must eat, and that if I withheld food from him, he would finally be forced to come out of the laboratory. So for all of one day, I set no food before his door. I sat grimly watching for him to appear, despite the almost nauseating animal musk which invaded the house from behind the laboratory door. But he did not appear. Determinedly, I continued to keep my vigil at the door, fighting sleep, which was not difficult, for in the quiet of the night I was aware of peculiarly disturbing movements within the laboratory. Awkward, shuffling sounds as if some large creature were crawling about, combined with a guttural mewing sound as if some mute animal were trying to speak. Several times I called out, and as often I tried the laboratory door anew, but it still resisted my efforts, being not only locked but also barred by some heavy object. I decided that, if this refusal to serve my cousin the food to which he had become accustomed did not bring him out, I would tackle the outer door of the laboratory in the morning, and force it by whatever means I could devise. I was now in a state of high alarm, since Ambrose's persistent silence seemed wholly unlike him. But this decision had hardly been made when I was aware of the frantic excitement of the dog. This time, unhampered by the chain which had hitherto bound him, he streaked along one side of the house and made for the woods, and in a moment I heard the furious snarling and growling which always accompanied an attack. Momentarily forgetting my cousin, I made for the nearest door, snatching up my flashlight as I ran, and running outside. I was on my way to the woods when I stopped short. I had come around the corner of the house, in view of the back of the laboratory, and saw that the door to the laboratory stood open. Instantly I turned and ran into the laboratory. All was dark inside. I called my cousin's name. There was no response. With the flashlight, I found the switch and turned up the light. The sight that met my eyes startled me profoundly. When last I had been in the laboratory, It had been a conspicuously neat and trim room, yet now it was in a shocking state. Not only were the impedimenta of my cousin's experiments tipped over and broken, but they were scattered over instruments and floor, fragments of partly decayed food, some that was clearly recognizable as having come prepared, but also a disturbing amount of wild food, remains of partially consumed rabbits, squirrels, skunks, woodchucks, and birds. Above all, the laboratory bore the nauseating, repellent odour of a primal animal's abode. The scattered instruments bespoke civilization, but the smell and sight of the place were of subhuman life. Of my cousin Ambrose, there was no sign. I recalled the large animal I had seen faintly in the woods, and the first thought that came to mind was that somehow the creature had broken into the laboratory and made off with Ambrose, the dog in pursuit. I acted on the thought and ran from the laboratory to the place in the woods from which still came the throaty animal sounds of a lethal battle, which ended only as I came running up. Ginger stepped back, panting, and my light fell upon the kill. I do not know how I managed to return to the house to call the authorities, even to think coherently for 5 minutes at a time, so great was the shock of discovery. For in that one cataclysmic moment, I understood everything that had taken place. I knew why the dog barked so frantically in the night when the thing had gone to feed. I understood the source of that horrible animal musk. I realized that what had happened to my cousin was inevitable. For the thing that lay below Ginger's bloody jaws was a subhuman caricature of a man, a hellish parody of primal growth, with horrible malformations of face and body, giving off an all-pervasive and wholly charnel musk. But it was clad in the rags of my cousin's mouse-coloured dressing gown, and it wore on his wrist my cousin's wristwatch. By some unknown primal lord of nature, in sending his memory back into that pre-human era, into man's hereditary past, Ambrose had been trapped in that period of evolution, and his body had retrograded to the level of man's pre-human existence on Earth. He had gone nightly to forage for food in the woods, maddening the already alarmed dog, and it was by my hand that he had come to this horrible end, for I had unchained Ginger, and made it possible for Ambrose to come to his death at the jaws of his own dog. I'm Christian Bravery. You have been listening to Savage Bites. Well, there we go, folks. The Ancestor. Well, it does say by H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. One suspects that Mr. HPL had little or nothing to do with this one. A lot of people give August Derleth a hard time for the quality of his tales. I didn't think he was that bad. Clearly not of the magnitude of HPL's own work. Well, obviously the ending was hugely telegraphed from early on in that story. We all knew what was going to happen, right, guys? But there we are. So, Derleth, not the best writer potentially, but we always must remain in his debt, for he is the one who, kept the light on for the HPL's work during the dark days when it was in total obscurity. So, in those ways, I think the world owes a debt of gratitude to the man. Anyway, there you go. If you enjoyed that story, or even if you didn't, heck, please just like and subscribe. Because that really helps me grow the channel. Yeah, and thanks so much for listening, as always, and I shall see you in the next one.